welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us here on Impolite Company. I am your host, Matthew Best, who is really excited to be the host of this wonderful show. You can listen live on www.gcpr.live. It's part of a network of some great shows. People should check that out. Here on Impolite Company, we defy the old adage, dive headfirst into religion and politics, those things you're not supposed to talk about. We do it in honest dialogue, showcase the power of seeing the humanity in people with different perspectives. People who are listening, you can always send me questions and comments. I love those. You can send that to contactimpolitecompany@gmail.com. I do answer those, so I appreciate when people send me messages. You can find previous episodes, listen to new episodes on popular podcast channels like iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can see the videos on YouTube. Just search for Impolite Company. Look for the logo with the little microphone that's behind me there, if you can see that. You can dive further into the topics that we talk about by going to my blog, which is pastormatthewbest.com. And if you enjoy what we're doing, I appreciate any type of support. I turn around, put it right back into the show. And so you can do that through buymeacoffee.com/Impolite Company. Before I get into today's episode, a couple of things that I'd like to highlight. You can show some love to Christ Lutheran Church here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in the heart of Allison Hill. It's the church that I'm called to serve as pastor, and it's a special place and community of healing. And what makes this church special is that we host 3 free health clinics that have had over 100,000 visits since 2018. So you can go to christharrisburg.org to check that out. If you care about homelessness, you can check out the Memorial Blanket Project. Each year, people make blankets for strangers. We welcome the stranger. And make an art installation to highlight homelessness and then give them all away at the end of the night. So we've done this in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, front lawn of the U.S. Capitol in D.C., last year in the steps of the Pennsylvania Capitol, and this past year, 2024, in front of the Liberty Bell. So you can go to memorialblanket.org. And lastly, if you're looking for a tool to help with conversations on the difficult topic of gun violence while seeing the humanity of others, you can check out American Roulette. I'm one of the authors of the book. It's a unique novel that highlights the humanity of the victims, the community, and even the perpetrator while offering no solutions. Because as soon as you start offering solutions, nobody's willing to listen. We just want to have conversation and get people seeing the humanity. All the proceeds go to organizations that address gun violence. So today, I am really excited to have this conversation, and you're going to find out what kind of a word nerd I am. I have with me today 2 very wonderful people, 2 very wonderful Lutherans, Dr. Samantha Bise and Reverend Dillon Epler. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for being here, and it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks. We're excited.
And so, Samantha, you are a social science professor who studies religious linguistics. So one of my fellow nerd words, or word nerds, I can say that. And Dillon, you're a Lutheran pastor who I think your church is in Tamaqua. Is that correct?
It is correct. Yeah.
Yes. And they're both the co-hosts of the Church Chatter podcast. Love the name. So why don't you share a little bit with folks what a Church Chatter podcast is all about? How can people find that? Let's start off with that.
Sure. So Dillon came up with the name, actually.
Okay.
And very long story short, I was not raised in a church. And I was 28 and I decided I wanted to go to church. Dillon and I were not married yet. We were dating. So we started going to church. I love language. I have degrees in English and anthropology and like all things related to culture and language. My doctorate's in language and culture, which I was getting at the time when I started going to church. And people threw around words like Son of God and salvation and all of these things where I'm like, I don't know what you're saying. So I became pretty obsessed. I spent the last 7 years obsessing over words. I wrote a book that comes out next year. And truly, the truth is I signed a book contract and it says that I will be active somewhere on social media. I'm like, Instagram, Facebook. And then I decided, a podcast. I could talk. I mean, Dillon and I already talked about this stuff. Let's just record it.
Right.
So we decided to do it together. That's my part of the story.
So I grew up in the church, and so I was familiar with the language. But the church has so much good language. Words
Right.
like epiphany and narthex and
Oh
labyrinth.
yeah.
We have really great vocabulary. And so I thought, well, instead of throwing it all out, all those old archaic words, let's take some of these words and with my understanding of biblical studies and theology, and Samantha's understanding of words and the root of the words and how to write them and how to think about them. Let's put those two things together, and so that's what we did.
Yeah, I
That's
like the
pretty awesome.
culture behind words, but I
Yeah.
realize oftentimes it gets into theology, which is more
Right.
like, all right, let's just do it together because I can't talk about theology.
Right. Right. Oh, that's great. And where can people find the podcast?
We're on YouTube. We are on Spotify and Apple
Apple
Podcasts. We're
Podcasts.
also on
Okay.
Instagram at church_chatter_podcasts. And we've got all the
Perfect.
links there.
And I definitely encourage people to go check it out. And then when you're there, you can find mine as well because we're on some of the similar
Absolutely.
channels. So today we're going to talk about words, which again, I cannot tell you how excited I am. If that doesn't say I am a word nerd, I don't know what does. But this is so important. This is so very important um, because like words are the foundation of so much, right? And I have said that oftentimes we're all speaking the same language, possibly we're speaking English, but we're not all speaking the same language,
No, we are not.
right? We use the same words but have different meanings when we're using them, and this is true in politics and religion, and that's what we're going to get into today. And this all, like I was mentioning before the show started, that I was really reminded of this in today's gospel reading, and I'm using the narrative lectionary. And so the narrative lectionary was Luke 6:1-16, and it's the story of Jesus and the Pharisees. And the gospel writers just has this wonderful way. It says one Sabbath, as it, whatever, versus these people who are like really strict, right? It's one Sabbath, whatever. And he encounters these people, and it starts off with some of Jesus' followers are taking some wheat and they crumble it in their hand and then they eat it. And the Pharisees are like, "Oh my gosh, you're doing work on the Sabbath." And Jesus kind of pokes right at him and said, "Well, David came in and took food right off the altar. Like, and are you saying that that's not a good thing?" And that the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Is this oof, right? And then again, another Sabbath, there's a guy with the withered hand, and the Pharisees are watching him just to see if he heals on the Sabbath. And then he knows, and he pokes, and he does it right in front of them on purpose. and, and it's just this conflict. So it ends up being, I realized this today in kind of preparation of thinking about, like, here they are, they're both talking about Sabbath, but they're not, right? I mean, because that has Sabbath means something, and the Pharisees are so concerned with making sure that they are following the rules that the rules become more important than what it is, and Jesus comes up with a different way. So I'm curious, have you studied the word Sabbath, Samantha?
Oh yeah. Well, and even the Sabbath is connected to, we've talked about the word freedom, Matthew. I know
Yeah.
the word freedom and liberation,
Yeah.
salvation. So for me, I go back, it all revolves around the Roman Empire every time you look into something. So the origin of Sabbath has to do with the Israelites
Right.
recently being liberated, wandering the desert. And I mean, they were enslaved, their parents were enslaved, their grandparents were enslaved. They don't know a life of liberation or freedom. They're
Right.
wandering the desert. And my favorite book of the Bible is Leviticus, which is not very
Ah.
popular. But I think about, I mean, liberation without structure is just chaos,
Right.
right? Like freedom is not, I can do whatever I want.
Right.
Freedom is about creating a society together. And sometimes that's messy, right? So
Oh
just
yeah.
the origin of the Sabbath has everything to do with salvation and how we're saved, right? Do you have thoughts on
Yeah,
Sabbath?
well, I'm thinking too. Since my, I've only been in the ordained ministry for a short time, and but I, at least in the area that I serve, a lot of times I'll get questions of, why aren't we still observing the Sabbath on a Saturday? And the Friday, the
Right.
Friday at dusk into Saturday during the day, and there seems to be sometimes when we're talking about the Sabbath, what we're talking about now, there's kind of this idea, well, that Sunday, that the Christian Sunday has taken over the Sabbath. That's not true.
Right.
That's not true at all. The Sunday, or the Lord's Day, as most Christians know it, is it can be somewhat paralleled, but they're two totally different things.
Right.
And so what Christians observe as the Lord's Day on Sunday, with Eucharist and prayers and songs and other things, and the Jewish Sabbath, those things can be held at the same, in the same way, but they're very different things, and they're both very beautiful.
Right.
So, you sometimes you think about you're talking about the same thing, but you're really not.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's talk about the rigidity, though. So with the Sabbath, I think about people who are in early recovery from addiction.
Yeah.
What's the first thing they need when they go to rehab? They have rules.
Yeah.
They have strict rules about bedtime and the parts of town they can't go to and who they can and can't hang out with.
Right.
A lot of people in recovery, they exercise in a very rigid way.
Right.
And that rigidity means something that can be good. But if you hold on to that for too long, and that's what Jesus was speaking out against, it becomes too much rigidity. You might as well be enslaved again to your addiction or to the Pharaoh. It's just the same thing. And I think Jesus was trying to say, hold on. Yeah, rules and structure, great. I'm here for it. But whenever it can circle back around and be just as much of a problem as the chaos in the first place. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I used, I talked about the example of, I can't remember when it happened. It was in the 1600s. And it was a woman, Mary Dyer, who was a Quaker in Puritan, Massachusetts. I am not a fan of the Puritans, by the way. I have been known to say the damn Puritans because they screwed up so many things, because they were like the Pharisees of that time. Right. And I'm using that kind of loosely, but as far as the rigidity and they had it. So like the Pharisees have this rigidity because they're so concerned with making sure that the law is kept because of the faithfulness and all this type. It starts from a good place. However, they lose sight of what it's about, right? They lose sight of the humanity. And so what happens with this woman is she ends up being hanged because she got kicked out of town. She comes back because she's really got nowhere to go. She's seeking some compassion, and it's a threat. She is a threat. Her existence is a threat to the Puritan order of things, because you know how dangerous those Quakers are. Hashtag sarcasm. And so they hang her, which is insane. But they do it by saying, oh, this is all for the will of God and all this type, they wrap theology around this excuse for this ends justify the means type of approach to things. And it's just this, I know we give a lot of I don't know, harsh critique on the Pharisees because they seem to be the first ones, although they're not the first ones. Right. They're the ones in the New Testament that show up with this. And then we have all these other branches of different religious belief that do the same type of thing, that have more concern with order and the letter of the law, and have lost sight of humanity and just get it all confused. And that's where we get a mess. So go ahead.
You can see that in individual, everything that I look at in society, I also try to be like, okay, where is that in me?
Right.
So Dillon and I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. So it's a very messy time of life. If I wake up and I have a lot to do on my to-do list and I feel overwhelmed, what do I start doing? I get rigid. I start telling and yelling at my husband and children, telling them to clean everything up. And then I have to stop and be like, why? They can play. It's fine. I'm controlling because I feel out of control. So I'm controlling. And that's also true with society at large. Those who are trying to control everybody, they feel out of control. So there's something really interesting there at the individual and social level.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've made that similar argument, not the child, although we have 4 children, but they're well past that age. But the idea of, usually it's this kind of projection, right?
Mm.
Whatever is going on inside of us, we're trying to have a sense of control. And and I even make the argument that this kind of goes back to, you can see the fall in Genesis 3. What is Eve really offered? It's, oh, you'll be like God, which humans interpret as you'll know and you'll be in control. And that's, again, really bad interpretation of what God is about. God doesn't have a need to control. God doesn't want chaos, as you mentioned. That's the whole story of creation, is bringing order out of chaos, but it's not the other extreme either.
Right.
We're all puppets on a string, and
Yeah.
every
It's so
single
much about maturity too. Like
right,
my 4-year-old is obsessed with following the rules because black and white comes first.
right,
And it's true for spiritual maturity too. Eventually, or like if you're getting clean from addiction, you have
right,
to eventually let go of the rigidity, but you got to start there. Like
right,
there's a time and place, but you can't stay there.
right,
I
right,
think I think too. It's interesting. If for those who attend some type of community of faith, there's usually some worship services are extremely liturgical, highly
right,
liturgical. Another word that we could talk about, not on here, but highly liturgical. And there's all these wonderful things, this pomp and circumstance. And then some are less liturgical, but they still have a form to them.
right,
Everyone gathers together. You hear the words and the stories. You share the Eucharist or communion, and then you're sent out to do the work of Jesus Christ.
right,
And so that, whether you are highly liturgical or less liturgical, there's still a form. And out of that form, there's a lot to play with there. And that has both a freedom to it and yet kind of a structure,
right,
which the Sabbath has always had.
right.
Form, and yet freedom. That's what is part of the Sabbath.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good. Well, so we kind of already talked about a little bit about Sabbath. Let's dive into some of these other words,
Uh-huh.
which we had talked about previous. So I got to go right to one of my favorite ones, which is freedom. Let's dive in. Let's talk about this word freedom, because what I have found, um, and maybe this is simplifying too much, but there's generally kind of two ends of the spectrum, right? There's a whole range, of course, when people are talking about freedom, and freedom gets used a lot, especially in political circles, and I think it gets used a lot in religious circles as well. And one end of the spectrum is freedom can go to the extreme of really being more of license, which is doing whatever you want. That's not freedom either, but it sometimes will get associated with that. But freedom, it kind of ends up being free from, right? So if we want to really be Lutheran, right? The freedom of a Christian, he talks about the freedom from and the freedom to,
Mhm.
right? And so the freedom from essentially being imposed upon, which doesn't give you license to do whatever you want, but also the freedom to, in that case, like serve. That's a really quick summary of
That's really good.
yeah. Well, I've talked about this a lot. So on the other end, you have this idea of there are groups and there are churches and whatnot that use this idea of freedom as we're specially ordained by God to freely impose upon other people God's way as we see it. What thoughts about freedom? Let's just leave it there. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I go back to the Israelites in the desert for
Yeah.
me, and I think about Moses coming down and giving those 10 commandments, one of them about keeping the Sabbath day
Yeah.
holy. You don't have to tell people not to murder each other if they're not
Right.
murdering each other. So I can
Right.
only imagine it was crazy.
Right.
I mean, I picture thousands of recently freed people. So I think that Moses had the wisdom through God to know, oh, freedom is, it can't just be we all do whatever we want, because
Right.
look at what happens. We all need a common form. We need common things and agreements, because you don't have to tell people not to murder, not to steal, not to covet if
Right.
they're not doing those things
Right.
already. So I think freedom, which we've already talked about, but it needs form and structure. Freedom is not do whatever you want. I think
Right.
about my kids again. So as a mother, as parents, if we tell our kids to do whatever they want, that would be terrible. because if the
Right.
things that we want aren't always the greatest, we need
Right.
to come together as a community, whether that's a family or a church or a nation or a state, and decide and like enter into the messiness of politics and decide, what does freedom mean? Now that gets messy. You could
Yeah.
argue that Moses came down and told everybody this is what God wants, and you could argue that's what people are doing now. You gotta like,
Yeah.
it gets messy, you know?
Yeah.
You gotta
Right.
do it.
Well, and it reminds me of kind of the idea of those boundaries, which is really what we're talking about, is it's given in a sense of love, right? It's
Mhm.
kind of like you tell your kids, hey, don't put your hand on the stove, which is, of course, almost an invitation for them to put their hands on the stove. But you do that for their own good of like, hey, if you do this, it's not going to turn out well.
Yes. Well,
Right.
even the Ten Commandments, which is supposed to give structure to these newly
Right.
freed people to covet, you can't see coveting. That's an internal thing. So
Right.
this is to free people from their own
Yeah.
kind of internal cages, I guess, in some ways. It's not just about these are the do's and don'ts, because some of
Right.
those do's and don'ts can't be seen. I could
Right.
covet my whole life and nobody would know.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No kidding. Okay, good. How about well, let's jump to liberation. That's a big word.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what are you thinking about this term liberation? Because again, this is a loaded term. It gets used, and often this is one of those terms that I think almost has reached a point where there's almost when you're talking about liberation, you're clearly just a left winger. Clearly, because that's the only folks who like own that word type of thing. So let's talk about this word liberation. What does it really mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, when I'm going to actually merge two of them together.
Yeah.
I'm going to take our password freedom and liberation and place them together.
Okay.
So I think in order to have liberation, you first have to have freedom.
Okay.
And so that for me, those two things kind of go together. And I think of, especially in a pluralistic world that we live in the United States in particular, it is what freedom means is that we're free to be able to worship and practice both in private and in public the faith to which we are born into, or we choose, or whatever you want to, however you want to look at that. And out of that, because we have the freedom to choose or to change, which is another one, that allows one to be liberated. It allows one to be liberated into something very new. When we have the freedom to stick with what we have been given, or to change, or to understand things in a different way, that liberates us to be able to practice both in public and in private what it is that we would like to do. And so I think those two things kind of go together. And one of the I'm a huge fan of the International Declaration of Human Rights, and one of the, I think it's 5 or 8, I forget what it, no, maybe it's 28, I forget. But it talks about the freedom of religion, the freedom of one to either follow what they've been given, or to choose something new. And out of that comes this liberation. And for me, my favorite holiday is Easter. And Easter for me is the great liberation.
Right.
It's this awakening, not only of newness and renewal and restoration and resurrection, all these wonderful words that the church uses, but it's a new way. And it's not forgetting about the past, but it's about moving forward and recognizing what has happened in the past, and how that has been a part of your whole being. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I would tie that in with the term resurrection.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Because like, if you take a look at the story of Jesus raising Lazarus, right? And so what's going on there is, Jesus weeps with the people, and he knows what he's going to do. And yet he's weeping with them because there's a loss. Death is real, and it has come to this community, and they're suffering this loss, and they're mourning, and they're going through all of the ritualistic mourning as well as the real human emotional mourning of loss. And so what does Jesus do? He raises Lazarus from the dead. And I like to point out, I'm like, he doesn't do a rewind. Lazarus still died. There
Yeah.
was still
Right.
mourning. There was
Right.
still all this pain and suffering and all this and sadness and all that type of stuff. And he died. It was
Yeah.
real. It was there. It stunk.
Yeah.
And when Jesus does this resurrection, as you were just saying, it's new life.
Mhm.
It's something new. It's not a rewind. And I think
Yeah.
oftentimes a lot of the church, I think, struggles with resurrection, because in order to get to resurrection, you have to go through death.
Oh, even more than that, Dillon and I talk about this all the time. So Father Richard Rohr.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So
Big fan.
Oh, yeah, us too. So the resurrection doesn't undo the cross. It transforms the death.
Right.
And what Dillon and I talk about a lot. So there's Good Friday, right? There's death. And then there's Easter Sunday resurrection.
Yep.
But there's descent in there.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yep.
And I think I've gotten pretty good. It's going to be a lifelong thing, but knowing of like, oh, something's dying in me. It's about to get dark up in here. And I just have to the only way around it is through it, and something new. I don't know what it will be, but something new is coming. Motherhood was that way for me. I mean, there've been so many things, but the descent, people forget about the descent. It's not just the death. It's then Jesus descends to the darkness, to the depths, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
Well, this is the thing. I've always like Holy Week is my favorite week of the entire year.
Oh, mine too.
Right? It's like the Super Bowl of the church year, as far as I'm concerned. Right? And that's putting it mildly, obviously. Yeah. But like those services throughout the week, the Easter Vigil is my favorite service of the entire year, because it does have this sense of sitting.
Yeah.
And and there's a ton of readings, and you sit and you wait. And I think I remember one of the services here in Harrisburg, one of our colleagues, I would always go to his Easter Vigil service, and the way they had it set up was just beautifully done. So it was one of these churches where the sanctuary is on the second floor, and the fellowship hall is in the kind of the first floor basement type of thing, right? And so the service would start outside with the fire, and then you go in to the basement where the tomb, right? And it's in kind of a dark, the lights are down, and we do the readings and all this type of stuff, and it's in this darkness, and it's through all these historical, the Old Testament readings and all that, which are incredible, and all of that. And then when it's time for the gospel reading, we go upstairs and it's all lit up.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, right. The sense of this, but those readings are long. And Samantha, I think you're really hitting on something really important, that waiting aspect of it, which you can't do anything about either.
Yeah, there's even a surrender to it. Now, I want to be really clear. That doesn't mean we don't resist when things are being there's resistance for sure, but there's a time to know when to surrender to the darkness, because something new is coming. I mean, if I think of like a caterpillar and a chrysalis, I think of Jesus on a donkey with palm branches. You have to surrender of like, oh, this is going to hurt. Yeah. This is going to be tough, but here we go. Something new is coming. Here we go.
I also think that, as we're thinking about this word liberation and its root and its meaning and how it's played out in our lives as both Christians, both in spiritual realms, but also in the political realm, I think of Easter and its power. Yeah. The power of Easter is that there's many different interpretations of this. So I clearly have a bias, but one of the great tenets of Easter is that no one is left behind. That everyone is liberated. That Jesus literally, even before the resurrection, goes into the depths of people of the past and liberates them from the gates and bondage of brokenness and darkness and pulls them up. I mean, if that's not liberation on Easter Day for everyone, not one person is left behind. That's
Yeah,
the power of
I feel you
liberation.
were like reading my mind because I was just about to say I heard a spiritual teacher once, not I think he was Buddhist,
Uh-huh.
I think, and he said something like he was meditating to reach enlightenment. But the
Mhm.
trouble is you can only get to the edge of enlightenment because once you get there, you have to turn back around and get everyone else. Because if it's not for all of creation, it's not
Wow.
enlightenment. I think liberation is the same way. I'm sure we all know a
Mm.
handful of people, they move through the world in what I call this liberated way. I think Jesus was this way, like open
Yeah.
palms. They're not too rigid or controlling. They're not attached to certain outcomes. They're just liberated. They've gone through some stuff, really. They've
Yeah.
come out
Right.
the other side. And those people know everyone else deserves liberation too. There's like a
Yeah.
kindness and a softness. You can't, salvation, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, it can't be individual. We can
Right.
only get to the edge of it, and then we've got to go bring everybody with us.
Oh, wow. There's so much there. Right. I mean, when you're talking about that, that just gives a whole different light to the story, the parable that Jesus talks about the lost sheep.
Mhm.
Right. And
Mhm.
I've been preaching more in line of the communal aspect of that story. You
Sure.
know, there's the 100 sheep and one goes missing and Jesus goes off. And in an American way, we go, oh, isn't it great to be that sheep? You know, in a more communal way, what is Jesus doing is he's reestablishing shalom in the community,
Mhm.
the wholeness, right?
Yeah.
Which is what I hear you're talking about, that bringing everybody else in, you know, Jesus would say probably is shalom. It's the
Mhm.
wholeness of it. How can it be whole if it's just one person? How can it be
Right.
whole if it doesn't impact all of creation?
Mhm.
You know, that's the wholeness of creation in there. That's absolutely beautiful.
I
So
talk, yeah, I maybe should mention this, but if I can, I think that every person, whether a Christian or not, if they can get a hold of, especially during Holy Week and on Easter Day,
yeah,
if they could, you know, the Western Christian tradition that we're in, Lutheranism
yeah,
coming out of Roman Catholicism, when you see an image of the resurrected Jesus, it's him and he's standing alone, and the open tomb is
right,
there, and he has the staff, and it's just him
uh-huh,
coming out,
right,
you know, from the tomb, and it's kind of a single or a soul
right,
resurrection story. But in the East, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they have this beautiful icon of the resurrection, and it is Jesus, and it's the saints, and it's the angels, and it's the brokenness of the stones, the binding
yeah,
of evil, and the pulling up of every single person
yeah,
from the past. I mean, oh, I get giddy just thinking
yeah,
about it.
Is that
It's
the one where
wonderful.
he's also, there's people like in the depths of hell, right? The metaphor
yeah,
of hell. He's like pulling
He's
them
pulling
out
them.
too.
He's
yeah,
Beautiful.
he's pulling them up, and it's a kind of a cosmic understanding, a
right,
communal understanding of the beauty of the Easter story, and
right,
not just this. It's a resurrection for everyone. It's not just the resurrection of Jesus.
right.
And there's something there that liberates people.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that gets into the wholeness idea. That
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that's the same icon I've seen of Jesus pulling Adam and Eve out of the
Oh
Yes.
yeah.
tomb,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's absolutely beautiful, and it does have that cosmic sense of, you know, what Adam and Eve signify of the humanity, you know, being
Hmm.
out of the
Redeemed.
depths of hell
Yeah.
and bondage and death and everything that symbolize, you know, the tombs are there and they're broken
Yes.
open. And so what the death is no longer in charge. The death doesn't get the say and have control. Death instead serves a different purpose, which of what I have said is that death gets in your face and says, hey, you're not in control. That's the purpose of death.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
then resurrection is seeing it as, oh, okay, death serves this purpose, but it's not the end.
Yeah.
Right.
And
There's something else.
and it's a beautiful thing when you look at Christ, the risen Christ, pulling up the Adam and Eve
Yeah.
figures and redeeming them in all of their humanity and their souls, and pulls them up. And look at the bottom of that icon.
Yeah.
It's a cross.
Oh, there you go.
There's a cross beam at the bottom of
Oh,
it
nice.
that it brings the whole thing together. All right,
Oh, that's great.
I could be on that forever.
Maybe that's a different show, so we could talk about icons. There's a ton of symbolism in those, though, that I
Sure.
think is just so very, it's no different than, like, our stained glass windows.
Absolutely.
They tell stories.
Church furniture in general,
Oh, right.
all of it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I remember in seminary, one of the professors talked about the idea that architecture trumps theology every time. And so what your architecture, how it's laid out and what you have in it will dictate what you actually believe. Then whatever you're saying doesn't always match up with what you actually believe. And I was like, ooh, that's
interesting. Yeah.
Wow. There's a lot there, and there's a whole lot of mismatch that happens oftentimes, unfortunately. But and part of it is, a lot of our churches go back to the height of institutional Christianity, and there was just the reality of, well, we need a big building, we need to have a theater style seating, we need to have this because of all the people. Okay, that makes sense. And there hasn't been kind of like, hey, let's rethink this, and what are we actually saying by what things look like.
Yeah.
So let's jump to another word. I'm gonna move us out of the freedom, liberation, all of that, and let's talk about, and this may seem like a really basic word, but the more I think about it, this is not. The word is Christian.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because there's probably, I have no idea how many different denominations of Christianity there are. Tens of thousands of denominations of Christianity in 2,000 years. Really, that's not even in 2,000 years. That's in the last 500 years.
Yeah.
And probably in the last 100 years, really, that it kind of like, we've gone into accelerated mode, because you had one until the break with the Orthodox, and then you're kind of going along, and then it's the Reformation, and then things start to explode and all that. And we can throw in Protestant as well, and what does that actually mean? So Christian, what?
Yeah.
Wow, we could spend a whole lot of time. I mean, this word gets thrown around a lot right now, especially in political circles. I saw a commentary, the vice president, JD Vance, was talking about theology and what love means. And he had a particular bent on that I don't necessarily agree with. And then, there's this term Christian nationalism and all of this type of stuff, and everybody's claiming Christian. So give us some thoughts on that.
Well, let's start with the fact that Christian comes from the word Christ, which comes from the word Messiah, which means the anointed one. Kings and emperors were anointed. So it's a very anti-political word. When we say that Jesus was the Messiah or the Christ, what we're saying is the Roman Empire isn't.
Right.
The emperor isn't. The oppressive powers that continue to exist today, 2,000 years later, they're not who we worship. We won't bow down for Domitian. We won't bow down for all of these rulers, right? We won't bow down to them. We bow down to Jesus. So it's very political.
Oh, yeah.
And like, if we just look at the language of it, I know two things that we say a lot on our podcast. I think every episode we end up saying, there never has been, and there still is not, one way to be a Christian. It is a very big umbrella. I'll say there are some harmful ways to be Christian.
Right.
For sure.
Plenty of history with that.
But there's no one right way, and there never has been. And whenever Dillon and I talk about the earliest Jesus followers, we were very intentional about saying Jesus followers. They were not Christians until Constantine.
Right.
And they were not unified. There were these little groups everywhere for a few hundred years. And they were called the way. They were called siblings or brothers and sisters. They were called a lot, the anointed ones, right? They were called a lot of things, not Christians.
Right.
And they were not unified. There were a lot of versions. So even now, I know that everybody knows this if you're interested in this stuff. But when we talk about a Christian nation, the question becomes, what Christians? Who are you talking about? Because it's probably not my Christianity.
Right.
It's probably not a majority of our Christianity. So that becomes a debate. Or like prayers in school. What Christian prayers? Because we're all praying very different things and for very different things on Sunday mornings.
Absolutely.
Do you have thoughts on Christian? There's a lot to be said about
I know, right?
Yeah.
obviously I am one. Um,
That's a good
but
place to start, right?
but
I mean,
I deeply struggle with it because it has become a word that has so many connotations to
right,
it, depending on what group or what people you're with, or an individual, whatever that may be. Yeah, they have so many different interpretations. I have come to my understanding as to, yes, I am a Christian. I'm a Christian pastor in the Lutheran tradition, and I am well aware that Christianity has never been monolithic. It's never been this. It's always
right.
been a big tent. I remember a very brief story when one of my ministerial fieldwork supervisors always used to say, when we all gather to say the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, we're saying it together in unity, but we're not saying it in uniformity.
Right. Right.
Because everyone has a little bit of a twist on that creed. They might understand it this way, they might
Right.
understand it that way, and it's about the unity that it brings to the church, not the uniformity.
Yeah.
And so Christian can mean. I do want to say this though. I sometimes I always think, like, somebody says, "Oh, well, I'm a Christian," or "I'm a believer," whereas, well, that's a
Hmm.
different thing. But
Yeah. Right. Right.
and I think, like, I sometimes, even as a pastor, I think, like, oh, but I'm not that type of a Christian,
Right. Right.
Ah, like I probably would share the same thing. I didn't hear the vice president's comments.
Hmm.
I shouldn't say this, but I probably also would not agree with them.
Yeah. It's probably
And
safe to say.
and I think that's pretty 110% safe to say.
Yeah.
I won't agree with him, but so you kind of find yourself like, do we need a new word? Do we
Right. This becomes the debate. This is the
do
same thing with evangelical, right? It's part
exactly?
of our
Oh, that's a
church
good one.
name, right? It's part of our church name. We're the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. As both
Right.
of us are pastors of this, and Samantha,
Yep.
you're a member of.
Mhm.
And so there's this debate going on about, well, do we ditch the word because it's unredeemable? Well, there's another word. Um, or do we try to claim it back, or do we just live into it, or what do we do, right? And there's a whole lot of debate. It's the same thing I hear with the word Christian, and I know I have a lot of friends and even some colleagues, and I have found myself oftentimes not using the word Christian because of the connotations, and it's much easier to not have this argument and debate. At the same time, it's not right to just cede the word to people that have co-opted, or and of course I'm thinking in short history. There's a long history, and while there's this sense of unity, there's also a whole lot of pointed sticks that have killed a whole lot of people who are also Christian, right?
Well, linguistically oppressed groups, there's a long history of reclaiming language,
Yeah.
right? Like, there are words used to describe certain people and they reclaim it. Derogatory words
Right.
used to describe women, and then women reclaim it and use it amongst themselves as almost like this empowering. There's a long history of oppressed people reclaiming words. I used to be quite radical about, like, no, that word's ruined, don't use it. And then I started this whole 7-year journey of, like, just every word, just reading everything I could find about it. I'm like, oh, there's actually too much richness to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's a good idea.
I also think too, Matthew, you and I had to do this in seminary through church history and all kinds of other things, but we don't really talk about this a lot in churches, or even groups of Christians who are not pastors. They don't really talk about this, but followers of Jesus were not always called Christians.
Right.
Right. In the first century and even before, there was no concept or even no word for Christian like we would think today as a follower of a certain religion. You were a Jesus follower, or a follower of the way, or you were a follower of the Anointed One, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know, that might be those terms, maybe follower of Jesus, that one's used. I don't know if I'd be all right even with I follow the anointed one. Although I do, I don't know. I don't know if that
That sounds a bit Gnostic.
it sounds a bit odd. You must have took the words right out of my mouth. I don't know. I don't know.
Almost getting a little conspiracy theory going on. You know, right?
So you think like if it were to be changed, what
Right.
would it be? Or do you reclaim it? I tend to think about reclaiming it. That's kind of my
I hear a lot of people saying I'm spiritual and I'm Jesus leaning. I'm Jesus leaning. Like they'll use that language. Like, I can't let go of Jesus, but Christian, no. And I get that. I also have shame, I'll be honest, attached sometimes with certain people saying I'm a Christian. There's a long history. And Dillon and I were just talking about this the other day. How do we be proud of the identity while also owning the harm that it's done? I'm not like a line to walk all the time. I feel like I apologize a lot, maybe even to a detriment of like a lot of disclaimers to the identity marker of Christian.
This is where I have, at least for the last couple of years, this isn't new for me, but I've been talking a lot about the need for the church to do intentional mourning. Because I think as a church, at least in America, American culture is terrible at mourning. Right? I mean, you have a funeral, and if it's a close relative, you get 3 days off, and then you better be back at work and as if nothing had affected you. That's insane. Like if you go back to in Jesus' time, the Jews have a year-long mourning process, right? And there's a week long, a month long, a year long, and certain things happen, and there's a process, whether you're feeling it or not. They knew something about you need to intentionally mourn, whether you want to or not. Because
Jewish wisdom, man, they always know what's up.
Oh, absolutely. Right. So there's this beautiful wisdom in this, and they knew it would take a long time. And yet in the church, we're really good at funerals. We're really awesome at funerals. We're terrible at mourning. And I think what Samantha you're talking about is this sense of mourning. How do we mourn? We don't have a liturgy for mourning. We don't have the sense of let's take the stuff that's not so good and let's mourn what the cost, because it impacted everyone, whether alive in the past or now. There's still this effect on it, and it's different than laying blame and pointing fingers. And it's saying, you know what, some bad stuff happened, whether it was intentional or not. Some bad stuff happened and it impacted people's lives, and there's still an impact today. We need to mourn that loss. And then what can we do to move towards shalom? Which
it also sounds like you're talking about repentance, which you read the book, Repentance. I read it. And now anytime Dillon talks about forgiveness, I'm like, well, let's not overemphasize forgiveness. Let's talk about the process of repentance. Yeah. In our culture, we don't know how to look at the darkness. An overused metaphor is seeds are pushed into the soil in the dark before they grow. And we don't know how to do darkness, which means we don't know how to do Christians, especially if we hold ourselves accountable, we say we're people of death, descent, and resurrection, but we don't know how to do that. Oh yeah, absolutely. Right. We lost it somewhere.
This is why we have trouble, at least here in this country, of talking about history. Or book bans and all this other type of stuff, because we don't want to deal with the past. It's uncomfortable and all this type of stuff. And until we deal with that, until we mourn the past, we can't be in the present. And if we're not in the present, we're not going to experience resurrection going forward. Right. I mean, that's literally past, present, future, the life, death, and resurrection. That's right. That's it.
I firmly believe salvation it's here and now. Right. It's here to be experienced now. And if we can't, like you just said, be in the present, because if we don't take accountability for what we've done, and that's true socially, right? We look at racism in this country. It's true. Like Dillon and I are married. We go through many processes of repentance 10 times a day with each other and with our children of like, oops, I shouldn't have done that. Oops, my tone was a little wrong.
Right.
There's just, this might be an odd bunny trail, but while we're talking about repentance and we're talking about mourning and we're talking about reflection of oneself and the community and how that can be deeply, deeply healing, I think of the season of Lent. And I think of, a lot of times years past, people would meet midway, usually on a Wednesday, for midweek services of prayer and reflection. We still do that at my parish, and many other parishes do it. But because of life being so busy, that coming together has kind of dwindled a bit. But I think there's this old tradition in the church. Some churches do it, some churches don't. But about shrouding or veiling the cross during Lent. And I think about all the mourning and the sorrow and the pain that we literally are called to lay before Christ. And this idea that our burdens we give to God, and we come and we mourn those, and we grieve those, and we give those away. We could really use a good, solid, deep year-long Lent. Grieving and mourning and taking that the Jewish tradition of shrouding things, of being shrouded, is a long tradition. Deeply rooted in healing.
Yeah, I picture a ball being pushed down in water. Like the more you push it down, it's just going to like explode up eventually, which is maybe what we're seeing right now in our country. We've pushed it down long enough; it can't stay underwater.
Right. Yeah, and Dillon, I'm right on board with you with this idea of this long intentional mourning, because it is countercultural.
It is.
People are going to struggle with that. And they'll get bored with it, right? Or whatever. Why are we still doing this? Well, because we haven't even scratched the surface. Is why, right? We're dealing with such a long part of history. This kind of goes along with, I don't know if I had said this before, but I saw a meme, and it was I don't remember who said it or anything, but the sentiment of it was, we should not be surprised by what's going on with the church and what the church is supporting, the people in the church, at least in the United States, because Americans don't come to church. American Christians don't come to church for transformation and encounter with Jesus, not most of them, but instead to hear how good of a person they are.
That's
wow. That hit me, and I was like, holy cow. Wow. Now all of a sudden it's kind of like, oh, right. And they were saying that this isn't anything new. This has been going on for a long, long time. And, I think about in my previous call, I've had people talk about like what they want in their funeral. I just want to hear, talk about what the good things that I did. Right. And it's like, oof, well, then you don't need Jesus. If that's the case, like,
I think it's so interesting. So this morning in worship, we celebrated the festival of the presentation of our Lord, following the common lectionary. And most people will focus that's the story of Jesus, 40 days after being born. His mom and dad bring him into the temple, and it talks about him being the light, and Simeon and Anna. Great story, wonderful story. But what we fail to realize, it's not just about Jesus's light coming into the temple, being that for the Gentiles and the people of Israel, but it talks about purification. It talks about repentance. It talks about forgiveness. Ooh, we don't want to talk about that. No, we just want to talk about the light that Jesus brings in. He does indeed, but he calls us to reflect on that which is in us, so that we can totally be transformed, liberated even.
Well, I bet both of you as pastors have, you give a sermon, you're saying goodbye to people by the door, and they're like, oh, I hope that person over there heard that sermon. But did you hear it?
I tell people that when they come through the recessional line, which is obviously most people, they'll tell me that. They say, Pastor, I hope that so and so heard this, and I'll gently say, but did you hear it?
Yeah. Well, I know for me, I'll usually end up saying, I don't know if you all heard it. That's your business, but I know I was preaching to myself.
Oh, good.
That's like, because I have no control over if anybody else is hearing anything, and I know, Dillon, the same thing. It's like you could have a sermon that's like, that was rocking, that was awesome, and you'll get nothing, crickets from people, and then you have what you would deem a terrible sermon or an off sermon or something, and you're like, oh man, that was terrible. And somebody like, Pastor, that was the best sermon ever. And I'm like, well, I'm glad that touched you, because it did
Didn't do
not
anything.
hit me at all. It was right. So
Oh,
anyway,
I'm with you there.
Well, as
Yeah.
Dillon's wife, I hear him give sermons on Sundays. I'm like, oh, he's wrestling with that
yeah,
himself.
oh yeah.
Talking about it. That's interesting.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think those are some of the best sermons, and we
Mhm.
maybe this will be the last word that we use is this term sermon, right?
Mhm.
I think some of the best sermons are the ones that we're struggling, right? And we can talk about the idea of look, here's this thing going on, and like I know a lot of pastors were struggling with what do you say either right before or right after the election. I, the answer is I don't know. God is faithful, and and there's hope, and it has nothing to do with who gets elected. It would be the same message regardless of who won, because that's not what our hope is in. Our hope is not in whatever political party or vision of America or whatever the case may be. That's not what Christianity is about. At least I'm willing to say that. I know there again ranges of it, but I think about like the idea of sermon, and for me, I think of sermon as it's a prayer from God, and I'm being utilized as a voice out. In one sense, it's kind of prophetic in that way. It's not my words; it's God's words. But in another way, um, it's also very political, not in the sense of partisan, but in the sense of the root word of political or politics is Greek, and it has to do with the many, the how the many are governed, how the many kind of interact, that sense of order, but also a sense of vision, right? It's this God. I have because I have this background in politics and religion, and I say look, they're the same. They deal with the different stuff, but they're both presenting a vision of a possible future when it comes down to it, both religion and politics. And the sermon is no different than a stump speech in the sense of presenting that vision of here's what God is presenting as a vision for this group of people in there. What are your thoughts in 2 minutes about sermons?
Well, I feel like a sermon is the same kind of expression. Like I'm an author, I write books, I write the books I need to hear.
Yeah.
And if you listen to people, I mean, I'm sure therapists and psychologists know this. I walk around telling people in my life, oh, you can't be oppressive. You can't, like, you need to let go of control. Why? Because I need to let go of control because I think I know what's right. We all
Right.
just expose our own things when we walk around giving advice. So I think that's one part is like we're all walking around I use books, you both use sermons. We're all saying the thing we need to hear. People, sometimes I think a lot of my writing is God writing through me. I've had those experiences, and I know Dillon has giving sermons. What do you think about the sermon?
Yeah, I think of that. I think of that passage. I can't think of chapter and verse, but the prophet Nehemiah talks about the stories are called to be interpreted for the day, and so every time that we proclaim the scriptures and hear them with our ears, the call of the pastor is to interpret them for what they were for their day, and also interpret them for what they may mean for our days today.
Yeah.
And so, as a preacher, in the role of the preacher, I try to look to the past and talk about that, but also bring it into the present and give hope for the future, because it's really the threefold there.
Right.
And so when I preach, when I do a sermon, I'm definitely sometimes talking about where I am, and yet also where my community is, the community that I serve. My sermons are very, very crafted. We don't put our sermons out for people to listen. That's just something they chose not to do.
Sure.
And so my sermons are very crafted for what does the story mean for the community?
Yeah.
And gets very specific sometimes. And so,
yeah, good stuff. Well, we could, boy, there's so many other words.
There's so many things we could say.
I know,
right? Lovely.
Yeah, but this is like the beautiful amount of time. We cover a little bit, and it keeps people wanting more. It's beautiful. So I thank you to both of you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I want to encourage folks again to check out the podcast Church Chatter. If you liked what we were talking about today, I know you're going to love what Samantha and Dillon are doing on their show. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And again, thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.